Today's daf is daf Lamed, and we'll start with Idach, which is on the top line. And we had a presentation of Rav's rulings in the name, which was brought to us by Rav Yosef. And Rav Yosef kept saying that every time Rav gave a ruling, there was a contradiction to Rav's ruling from a brisa. So we did one. Now we're doing the second, Idach. Another statement that Rav Yosef brought in the name of Rav, the Omer Rav, HaKosev Sefer Torah Ubal Ligmar, when he's about to finish the Sefer Torah, then Gomer Afilu Be'emtza Daf. And we're going to see a contradiction to this statement of Rav that at the end of the Sefer Torah, wherever he ends, that's where he ends, even if he ends in the middle of a daf, right? There are dapim, and those are the various columns, and wherever he finishes, that's where he finishes. Meisvei, but we saw a brisa that contradicts Rav, HaKosev Sefer Torah, Balo Ligmar, so he's coming to finish the Sefer Torah, Lo Yigmar Be'emtza Daf. He should not finish the Sefer Torah in the middle of a daf, but rather at the end of the daf, which contradicts Rav's statement that afil b'emtza daf, it doesn't matter even if he gets to the middle of this column. And then the Brisa points out that kiderech shegomer b'chumoshim, they had chumoshim which the scribe would write an entire chumash, let's say Breishis, Shmos, whatever it was, and they weren't bound by the same requirements as they were for writing a Sefer Torah. So with regard to a Chumash, they could be Gomer Afil Be'emtza. That Rav is correct with regard to a Chumash. So the end of the Chumash could be wherever it ends on the column, in the middle, fine. But with regard to a Sefer Torah, the Brisa insists that you have to end at the bottom. And lo yigmar be'emtza daf. Now, the problem is, how does the sofer calculate at what point he's going to reach the end of the daf so that he could complete the Sefer Torah at the end of the daf? So on that, the Brisa gives you an eitzah for the sofer, ela mekatzer v'holech ad sof hadaf. Meaning that if he doesn't have enough to fill the last column of the Sefer Torah, then mekatzer v'holech, which means that instead of writing a full line, he should write only part of a line, which would mean that he could even write one word on a line and on the next line another word. So if it says Vayomer Hashem El Moshe, he'll write Vayomer on one line, Hashem on the second line, El on the third line, and Moshe on the fourth line. All this is to guarantee that he will complete the Sefer Torah on the bottom of the column, of the last column. So the Gemara now defends Rav, Ki ka'amar Rav b'chumoshim. We thought that Rav's statement, and that's what we had in the literal transmission of Rav, that Akosi Sefer Torah, but cross out Sefer Torah and replace it with the word chumoshim. And therefore, Rav would agree, based on the Brisa for sure, that the Sefer Torah has to be completed on the bottom of the column. That statement of Rav that says that Gomer Afilu B'emtza Daf, that's referring to Chumoshim. Now the Gemara is not excited about crossing out words in the ruling, in the literal transmission of Rav's words. So therefore, is there any way we could push it into Rav when that's what the Gemara asks for Sefer Torah come, and the Gemara answers B'chumashim shel Sefer Torah, meaning that the Chumashim are not considered a complete Sefer Torah, but yet each Chumash does have the status of a partial Sefer Torah. So many of the laws of Kedusha Sefer Torah will apply to the Chumashim. But Rav wants to point out that there's one law that would apply to Sefer Torah that's Niskadesh B'Kedusha Sefer Torah that doesn't apply to Chumashim, and that is the halacha of Gomer B'Sof Hadaf. with regard to Chumashim, you could be Gomer be Emtza Hadaf. So again, when he's writing all five Chumashim, and now he's up to Sefer Dvarim, and he's moving towards the end of Sefer Dvarim, then we have Halacha Bekatzev Aholech Ad Sof Hadaf. Whatever he has to do to thin out and stretch out the words on the last daf, on the last column, that's what he has to do, because he sees that he's not going to get to the point where the Sefer Torah will complete itself in the bottom of the column. So the Gemara is not happy with this. V'eini va'omar Rabbi Yoshua bar Abba omar Rab Gidl omar Rav. Li'eini kol Yisrael, the last three words of the Torah, b'emtza daf. They could be in the middle of the daf. They don't have to be all the way at the end. In other words, you could allow for blank space from Li'eni Kol Yisrael until the bottom of the column. Hahibi emtza shita itmar. So this means that what we had in the name of Rav Gidol Amarav was with regard to emtza shita, meaning that Li'eni Kol Yisrael has to be on the bottom of the column, because that completes the Sefer Torah, and the halacha is Mekatzer V'Holech. But the last three words, Li'eni Kol Yisrael, they could be in the middle of a shita, of a line. So you don't have to have Li'eni Kol Yisrael fit at the end of the line, so that you Mekatzer V'Holech, so that you'll have enough words on the bottom line so that Li'eni Kol Yisrael will be at the end of the line. The last three words of the Torah could be in the middle of a line, but it's got to be in the last line of the column. Rabbanan Amri Af Be'emtza Shita. So this Shita of Rav is in accordance with one of the two opinions in the machlokas between Rav Ashi and Rabbanan. Rav and the Rabbanan hold that the last concluding words of the Sefer Torah could be written in the middle of the line, but Rav Ashi Omar be'emtza shita dafka. So whereas the Rabbanon would allow you, if need be, to write Li'eni Kol Yisrael in the middle of the line, but if things were ideal and perfect, they would require that you write Li'eni Kol Yisrael at the end of the line, so that the Sefer Torah completes itself at the last line of the last column. But Rav Ashi holds that, on the contrary, it's more beautiful for the Sefer Torah if the last few words, Li'eni Kol Yisrael, are written in the middle of the line. And not only that, it makes it more apparent to the eye that these are the last words of the Torah, because otherwise, why is there blank space beyond Li'eni Kol Yisrael? Behilchasa, and we actually paskin, like Rav Ashi, that be'emtza shita dafka, that it's even more beautiful to enhance the beauty of the Sefer Torah by completing the Sefer Torah with Li'eni Kol Yisrael in the middle of a line. Amar Rabbi Yeshua bar Abba, Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav. Shmona psukim shvat Torah, the last 8 psukim in which the Torah transmits the death of Moshe, Yachid Kore Osan Bebeis HaKnesses. Now here we have machlokes between Rashi and other Rishonim as to what does it mean Yachid Kore Osan Bebeis HaKnesses. Normally, 8 psukim can be divided into 2 aliyos, where you would have 4 psukim, which is above and beyond the minimum of 3, and another 4 psukim. So Ruvain will read the 8th pasuk before the end, and the 7th pasuk before the end, and the 6th pasuk, and then Shimon will read the last 3 psukim. So Rashi says that Yachid Koryosa means we cannot split half of the 8 psukim for Ruvain and half for Shimon, but rather Ruvain, if it's Ruvain, he'll have to read all 8 psukim. Now, Tosfos is not happy with this, because Tosfos says that at the time of the Gemara, what happens is that they didn't have the minhag that we have today, that you split the kriya between the Ola and the Kore, but rather there was only an Ola, and the Ola read the Torah out loud. So Tosas offers an alternative explanation for Yachid Kore Osam Bebeis HaKnesses, and he offers a possibility that just trying to remember the sheet of Tosas just for a second, that sorry, just give me a minute to catch up here. So there are another couple of possibilities here as what Rav Gido Amarav means by Yachid Koryosam. One possibility is that you don't need a minyan for the last 8 psukim, which is a pella. And another possibility is that the Balkore reads the 8 psukim, and normally the Ola will read along with the Balkore, but in this case, only one person should read it. Because these last 8 psukim are psukim shel tsa'ar, of anguish, and therefore we want to minimize the amount of people that are reading these psukim. But again, that pshat will assume the premise that there are 2 people reading for every aliyah at the time of the Gemara, meaning there's the Ola and there's the Balkor, but that's not so. That was not the minig at that time. So when you tell me Yachid Osam that, only the Ola reads and no one should read along with him, or the Balkori should read and the Ola should not read along with him, that's impossible in the historical context. Now the Gemara wants to quote Reb Shimon's disagreement. Kiman delok Reb Shimon, the Sanya we learned in a Brayso, Vayom Hashem Moshe Eved Hashem. Now, if we assume that Moshe Rabbeinu is writing these psukim, he's got to be alive. How can he write that Moshe died? That's michzik shikr. That's like a sheker. After Moshe chai v'kosva Yom Hashem Moshe, is it possible that Moshe is lying and he writes down in the Sefer Torah that Moshe died when he's alive writing the Sefer Torah? Ela ad kan kosav Moshe, mikad v'ela kosav Yeshua ben Nun. So the last 8 psukim, according to the Tanakama, this brayso, were written by Yoshua ben Nun. And that's Divrei Rabbi Yehuda and Amrilei Rabbi Nachem. Now, the reason why Yoshua was given to write the last 8 psukim is because it was too much anguish for Moshe Rabbeinu to write these 8 psukim. Moshe Rabbeinu had a career, dream that he would reach Eretz Yisrael. He couldn't write it himself. He gave it to Yoshua to write. However, Amalo, Rabbi Shimon comes to disagree either with Rabbi Yehuda or with Rabbi Nechemiah, and he says, Efsha Sefer Torah chaser os achas? Can it possibly be that Moshe Rabbeinu did not have the entire Torah, but rather, after his death, Yoshua filled in the last 8 psukim posthumously, because otherwise it's sheker. How could he say Vayomas Moshe if Moshe is still alive? So it must have been that after Moshe died, that's when Yoshua filled in the last 8 psukim. But Uksiv, we have a pasuk that says, Lo koach es sefer Torah zev v'samto so. Moshe Rabbeinu calls it a sefer Torah. And a sefer Torah has to be a complete sefer Torah. If it's missing one letter, it's possible. Ella, so therefore, Rabbi Shimon says it can't be that Yoshua wrote the last 8 psukim, but rather Ad Kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, Hu Moshe Kosev. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated into Moshe's ears the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu would then be Omer. Omer means he would repeat the words that he heard from Hashem, and then after repeating them, he would write them. That's as far as the entire Torah, according to Reb Shimon, except for the last 8 psukim. But mikan v'elech, for the last 8 psukim, Kadosh Baruch Hu Omer, Moshe kosev b'dema. Moshe did not repeat the words of Hashem. That's number one. So in the last 8 psukim, it was too much to ask of Moshe Rabbeinu to recite out loud those words of the last 8 psukim that describe his death. That was too much of an anguish for Moshe Rabbeinu. But Moshe Rabbeinu did write those last 8 psukim. Hence, according to Rab Shimon, we could justify the pasuk of Lakach Sefer Torah Zeh because Moshe Rabbeinu already in his lifetime had a complete Sefer Torah. K'mo shenemar lahalon vayomer lehem baruch mipiv yikra elai es kol hadvarim ha'elav ani kosev ala sefer b'dio. So this pasuk is a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, in which, Yirmiyahu was the Mekonen who lamented the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and his second in command was Baruch the Sofer, Baruch the scribe. And this pasuk that we just read indicates that the scribe, Baruch, did not say the words, but he just wrote them down because of the agony over the words that describe the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, it's Yikra Elias Kol Advar Ma'ela, so that Yirmiyahu Hanavi would dictate to Baruch the scribe all these things. Vani Kosev. And all the scribe did was he immediately committed them to writing without repeating them out loud. And Rabbi Shimon quotes this pasuk as a parallel to the last 8 psukim in the Torah, where Moshe Rabbeinu did not repeat them out loud. However, we have to add another point here that's very important, and that is what's unique about the last 8 psukim, which were written by Moshe, according to Rabbi Shimon, is not only that Moshe didn't call out and recite the psukim out loud before he wrote them, but in addition, he wrote them not with ink, but rather with dema, with his tears. And so we see that the last 8 psukim, even according to Rav Shimon, have a separate halacha. According to the first Tana, let's call him Rab Nechemia, for sure the last 8 psukim have a separate category, separate din, because they were not written by Moshe, they were written by Yoshua. But according to Rav Shimon, that the last 8 psukim, like the rest of the Torah, were written by Moshe. What is different about the Chefza, if you will, the entity of the last 8 psukim, that it has its own halachas? For example, Koriyos on Biyachid. What's different about the last 8 psukim if they were written by Moshe? And the answer is twofold. There are 2 differences. Number one, before writing them, Moshe Rabbeinu did not speak out these psukim. And number 2, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write them with ink, but rather write them with tears. And that means that the last 8 psukim had a separate halacha, a different, as we'd say, chalushem, because the entire Torah had to be written with dio, with ink. The Gemara says, Lema de lo ki Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon was of the opinion that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the last 8 psukim. But Rav seems to say that the last 8 psukim were different than the rest of the Torah. Apparently they weren't written by Moshe Rabbeinu. No, the Gemara says, I'm so sorry. So how can we reconcile Rav with the Shita of Rabbi Shimon that Moshe Rabbeinu indeed wrote the last 8 psukim? Hol v'ishtene. Because the last 8 psukim were written in a different way. Number one, as we said before, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't recite the psukim before he committed them to writing. Number 2, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it in tears and not with ink. Now, every person has to have his own Sefer Torah. That's the last of the Taryag mitzvahs. If you buy someone's Sefer Torah, then in a sense, you're robbing him of his mitzvah. The Gemara, I don't know why, but the Gemara assumes that the seller has only one Sefer Torah. And therefore, if you buy his Sefer Torah, then kechotef mitzvah nashuk, you're basically underlying his mitzvah. You yourself, by buying his Sefer Torah, will fulfill the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. But now you're undermining his mitzvah. Ksavo malal of akasav kilu kiblo esi. But if, on the other hand, somebody writes a Sefer Torah instead of buying it, so although in terms of the strict mitzvah, buying a Sefer Torah is sufficient to fulfill the mitzvah, because bailus, ownership on the Sefer Torah, is the bare minimum. But you could check off this mitzvah on your checkoff list for mitzvahs. But the ultimate mitzvah would be to write a Sefer Torah. However, not everyone is able to write a Sefer Torah. I can't. I don't know if you can. So therefore, Rav Sheshes in Higia afilu os achas ma'alav hakosu kilu ksava. Even though he didn't write the Sefer Torah, but if he fixes one letter, I don't know if you've ever been at Achnasa Sefer Torah, they usually have people waiting online there to fill in one letter, then that's considered as if he wrote the entire Sefer Torah, and therefore it's Ki'ilu Kiblo Mehar Sinai. Tana Rabbanu, we learned to the Brisa, Osa Adam Yuriya Mibas Sholosh Dapim Viad Shmona Dapim. And again, this is a ruling for the sofer, and the minimum is going to be shlosha dapim, right? So we talk about a urea, right? Urea is made up of a number of different dapim, of different columns, and then we sew together one urea with another. You've seen it. So now, how many dapim make up a urea? Minimum 3, maximum 8. So you can't have 2 dapim for one urea. You can't have 9 dapim for one urea. And therefore, pachas mikav yeser kan lo yaseh. Now the issue is going to come up if what happens if they sewed up the urea and there were only 2 dapim, or there were 9 dapim. What do we do in that case? Is the Sefer Torah puzzle? It's invalid. We'll see about that. And the reason why the halacha discourages the sofer from writing too many dapim for one urea is because it doesn't look like a Sefer Torah. It already looks like an igeres. An igeres is like a letter of greetings that you write to a friend, and you keep adding more and more columns. That's fine. Why can't there be less amount of dapim, like for example 2 dapim instead of 3? Apparently, if there are many columns, then there might be less words on the column, and the eye of the seer starts looking for the next couple of words, so he doesn't focus on the words themselves. Ella, so how many words should there be per line without overdoing it, so that the eyes of the reader will be able to see from the beginning of the line to the end? If you have too many words on the line, he won't see where he has to get to. Kigon lemishpachosehem. Now, this word lemishpachosehem has 10 letters in it. Sholosh pa'amim, 3 times 10 is 30. And therefore, the maximum number of words on each line would be 30. No, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. What I said is wrong. Just 1 second. We're talking about dapin. Okay, fine. Yeah. Let me get it again and get it right this time. What we're talking about is, just 1 second. Are we talking about dapim or shuros? Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Well, you might be dapim nesheina mishotatos. So we're talking about dapim. El kigolim mishpachoseihem shalosh pamim is 3 times is 30. Just when something's missing here, and I'm not sure if these. Oh, I see. If he has too many words on a line, then by definition, he's going to have to expand the daf. Do you follow what I mean? Right? How much can the daf accommodate? Well, that's a function of how many words you have on a line. So you can expand the daf to accommodate up to 30 words. But if you have more than 30 words on a line, then you're going to have to expand the column itself, the daf itself. And what's going to happen as a result is that if you expand the daf too much, then ein of mishotatos, right? He can't see all the way to the end. So you want the columns to be narrow, not too narrow, but not too wide. What happens, and this was the question that I hinted at before, the maximum number of dapim per urea was 8, and now he finds 9. So the simple way of solving the problem is to divide it 5 and 4. Lo yachlok sholosh lekan v'sheish lekan, ela arba lekan v'chomish lekan. Let's say he decides, for whatever reason, that he wants to minimize the number of columns in the urea. So what he does is he has a urea ending after 3 columns, and now he has another 6, and that's fine, right? There should be no problem because now he's got the minimum of 3 columns per urea. He hasn't expanded over the maximum, which is 8 lines. And the reason for that is because he only has 8 columns. He only has 6 columns. No. Arba lekan v'chomish lekan. If you have too many ureos in one, if you have too many dapim in one urea and very few dapim in another urea, it looks off-center, so it doesn't look beautiful. The beauty of the Sefer Torah is when the number of columns in each urea is very similar. I mean, you can have a difference of 1. So this column, this urea has 5 columns and this has 4, but not to go to an extreme. However, Bamedvarim Amurim, when do we say that we don't want too many columns, more than 8? We don't want too few columns, no less than 3. That's only betchilas hasefer. However, besof hasefer, afilu posek echad, vafilu daf echad. We don't mind minimizing the number of columns in a urea when he gets to the end of the sefer because it's very appropriate or very much accepted and anticipated that when he gets to the end of the sefer, he may have less number of letters. So he's already attached the urea to the one before the end, the last, and now he's up to the last urea, so it doesn't matter. He could have even one pasuk and one daf. Now, what does it mean, one pasuk? I mean, didn't we just finish saying that the Torah has to be completed all the way on the bottom of the last daf? So how can you possibly say pasuk echad on the last daf? Pasuk echad sal kedaitkal ema pasuk echad bedaf echad. It doesn't mean that he's got one pasuk on the last daf. That can't be acceptable. He's got to finish the Sefer Torah at the bottom of the daf. One pasuk won't do it. But rather, somewhere towards the end of the Sefer, he will have one pasuk. Okay, now the Gemara approaches the following issue. Every column has a gillion on top, which is empty space, and a gillion on the bottom. How much space should he allow on top? How much space should he allow for the gillion on the bottom? Sheer gillion. There's a difference between the top and the bottom. Milamata tefach, milamala sholosh etzbos. Now, sholosh etzbos. Just 1 second. All right, he doesn't tell you exactly how many etzbos are in a tefach, but I think there are two different measurings of a tefach. It's either 5 etzbos or 6 etzbos. I'm trying to remember where we learned that. I think it was in Erevin, I'm not sure. But anyway, so it comes out that there's a larger empty space on the bottom than there is on top. So Rashi explains why. Rashi says that there's something called mishmush, meaning the hands, get come in contact with the parchment, even though, again, we don't touch the parchment, but in principle, and therefore that happens more at the bottom of the Sefer Torah, where, like, when they're moving, from the bottom of one column to the top of the next, so they touch, and then mashmesh in the bottom, and therefore you have to leave more space, empty space, so you don't ruin the letters of the Sefer Torah. Very rare, says Rashi, will anyone start touching on the top of a column. And therefore, on the top of the column, all you need is a margin of shalosh etzbos. Ubein daf l'daf. Now we want to know how much of a separation should there be from one column to the next. Kimlo revach shtei etzbos. Okay, so we need 2 etzbos, this width, between one column and another. Bechumashim, and as we said before, the chumashim of each individual chumash don't have exactly the same requirements as the Sefer Torah itself. Is then milamata sholosh etzbos. How much of a margin do you have to leave on the bottom? Not a full tefach, but half a tefach, sholosh etzbos. And milamala shtei etzbos. All you need is 2 etzbos. We don't have to worry so much about the possibility that he may be mamashmesh and ruin the letters itself, because we're only talking about chumashim that don't have the kedusha, full kedusha of Sefer Torah. Now, we said that in the case of a Sefer Torah, from one daf to the other, we need 2 etzbos to separate one daf from the other. Ubein daf l'daf. In the case of chumashim, kimelo revach gudol, only the width of his thumb instead of shtei etzbos. Okay, now, bein shita l'shita, one line, another line. How much space should there be between one line and the next below it? Kimlo shita, the width of a shita. So it's a shita, space. A shita, space. Ubein teva l'teva, what empty parchment has to come between one word and the next word? Kimlo os ktana, like the size of the yud. The yud is the smallest letters, and the yud size is required to separate one word from another. Ben os los, how much do we need from one letter to another letter? Kimlo chut hasara, which is the smallest amount, a hair's breadth, and that means that as long as they're not touching each other, you can have two letters that are almost contiguous, so right next to the other. Okay. Now, what happens? This is all an issue of writing a Sefer Torah that's addressed by the Bryce. What happens if you have a choice between 2 negatives? Which one is worse, so to speak? Or which one is more important so that you have to give up on that on the other one. And what does it mean? Let's say the sofer is realizing that he won't have enough space on the bottom, or maybe he won't have enough space on the top. And the only solution that he has is called lemaitas aksav. What he wants to do is he wants to make the letters smaller. If he uses the same size letters, he won't have the full shear of the margins, which is a tefach on top. I'm sorry, which is a shalosh spots on top and a tefach on the bottom. So it's a matter of choosing the lesser of two evils. And the Brisa states, Al Yamait Adam Saksav. You should not reduce the size of the letters. Lo mipnei revach shel bata, lo mipnei revach shel mala, lo mipnei revach shebein shita l'shita, v'lo mipnei revach shebein parsha l'parsha. So that what's critical here is not to be mamait the ksav, which honestly, I find that a little bit strange because I don't know if you guys have ever seen a small Sefer Torah and they cost hon toafot. I remember when you could buy a Sefer Torah for $35,000, which you can't get today, forget it. It's 50 and above, maybe 60 and above. But if you wanted to buy a small Sefer Torah, which is so easy to take from place to place, it would cost you $100,000, like pi shalosh. So I'm not exactly sure why are we paying more for Yemaitis Aksav. What I think is going on here, and again, don't quote me on this, is that when the Gemara, the Brisa says Al Yemait Adam Aksav, means relative to the ksav of the next line. Do you follow what I mean? He's getting towards the bottom and he sees he's going to include on the last 3 tefachim of margin space, of empty space. So in the last couple of lines, he starts making it very narrow. So you'll see that most of the column has larger letters, and now all of a sudden he's writing small letters. That looks very, very strange. I mean, we do it in fonts and computers like Word documents, but that's only to emphasize something at the expense of the other, which we can't do in a Sefer Torah. So if you have larger letters on one column and smaller letters on that column, or for that matter, if you have larger letters on all the columns, and then on one column, you all of a sudden you write smaller letters, then you're giving, like you're downgrading the importance of those words in the Torah. That you can't do because all the words in the Torah, even Alufei Esav, have the same Kedusha as the rest of the Torah. So he may have to give up on many different things in order to maintain the same size of the letters so that he's consistent in the size of the letters. He'll give up on the revach lamala lamata. He might have to give up on the space between one shita and another. And now we have something called revach bein parsha leparsha, which we're going to have a whole long discussion about this. When you finish one parsha and you start another parsha, there has to be a separation. But again, that separation, even if necessary, does not warrant or justify lowering or minimizing the size of the letters. Then the Brisa says, "Lo yichtov shtayim v'toch hadaf v'sholosh chutz l'daf." Let's say the column ends here and he has another letters that he has to add. He's allowed to go beyond the end of the column into the empty space of the gilyon between one column and another, but only 2 letters, not 3. Now, this halacha has one very important exception, and that's Yud Kei Vav Kei, the name of God. The name of God cannot be split half in the column and half on the margin of the column. That you can't do. But any other word other than Shem Hashem, you could actually extend it into the margin beyond the end of the column, but up to a maximum of 2 letters.